Amazing individuals with us. The first, who I must note, is chairman of our company board, former Congressman Louis Stokes. Welcome, Congressman.
Thank you.
And also with us is someone who is really the personification of cross-sector. A gentleman who really, there's nothing I can say that would capture your background in the cross-sector sense, but former Congressman Dan Glickman, Secretary Glickman, President Glickman of the Motion Picture Association of America, currently with the Bipartisan Policy Center
and Aspen Institute.
And Aspen Institute. And we all love the Aspen Institute, of course. And we're going to have an interesting discussion based on what my wife and business partner came up with today, which is Furlough Mageddon, which took place today. It's a very sad day in Washington, but there is some light and sunshine here with two individuals that served in the U.S. Congress together, actually, and on the same committee at one point, coming together on a day that the government is actually right now shut down. So with that, we'll launch right into the interview.
Excellent. Thank you so much both for joining us. You're very established individuals, and it's a pleasure to have you here as part of this group, Ideagen. We have some great questions to ask, and we could go on all morning because, like George said, what a day to be speaking with you folks based on the current events in Washington. I will start with one of the first questions we generated, which is on the subject of addressing issues here in Washington based on your background. You have extensive experience and passion for addressing issues such as health and hunger, especially for refugees and those displaced by war. How can we better treat those who are affected by war, mentally and physically, in this country and around the world so that they can re-enter into society?
Is that for me, or is it?
Sure.
Whatever. Well,
Sure.
first of all, I want to say what great pleasure it is to be with my former chairman, Lou Stokes, chairman of the Intelligence Committee and of an Appropriations Subcommittee, but I was on the Intelligence Committee as a more junior member with more hair. This is what happens to you when you start too long, you know. But Lou was an exceptionally well-liked and respected member of the Congress, and bipartisan too, I would say, which is interesting that today you should have us both on, because I think both of us are big advocates for civility and bipartisanship and lived our jobs in that way. Now it's much more tribal. Your adversary is your enemy today, not somebody that you're going to do business with tomorrow and need them as an ally. So I would say that. The specific answer to your question is that I think the fundamental issue here is America's role in the world. So America is a leading face for engagement in the world, from diplomacy, from helping folks bring themselves up from hunger, humanitarian, as well as defense. I call it the 3 Ds. And there's a great tendency in this country to, in some circles, to want to disengage. And so that affects, people who hurt around the world, folks in the developing world, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And that's a very, very serious mistake for the U.S. For a lot of different reasons. But so I'd only say, just as a matter of public policy, that America, even though people tire of us being involved in foreign wars, and so am I, I'm not really talking about military involvement. I'm talking more about America's engagement in the development and the diplomacy area, which means humanitarian relief as well. We still are the leaders in the world, and nobody's even remotely close to us. We supply half the food aid in the world, America alone. Everybody else supplies the other half, and so we just really have to stay engaged and active. And I think you've seen there's been a lot of discussion and even some criticism about the whole issue of Syria with this massive humanitarian problem. But it's still the United States and Secretary Kerry and others who have led the effort to perhaps reach a solution over there. And the same thing's true with Iran. The deal is not the Iranians with the Brits, it's the Iranians with the Americans, and trying to work this out. So America can only do that if it stays engaged, which means we have to continue to make sure that we commit enough resources to the budgets. Interesting, because of what's happening in the budget now, to provide that leadership around the world. And that, therefore, issues like health and hunger and others are addressed in that process.
So,
If I
again,
can just add a moment.
please.
I just want to take a moment to say what a pleasure it is for me to be here this morning with Dan Glickman. We had a great personal friendship while he was in the Congress, and I was there also. And he's someone for whom I have great respect and very high regard. As was mentioned by George in his introduction, at one time we served together on the Intelligence Committee of the House, and that was an opportunity to really get to know one another and to build the kind of respect we have for one another. And so he's gone on to so many great careers since leaving the Congress, and so you're privileged this morning to have this giant before us here today, sharing in this great meeting.
It's just been hard to keep a job, Lou, that's why.
You've done very well.
So, Congressman, thank you. You know, in light of what's happening today, you know, I'm a student of politics and also an undergrad history major like you, Mr. Secretary, and I feel like there must be a few things that you all could articulate to the cross-sector assembly here today that would demonstrate how we can begin dialogue on the Hill in light of gridlock. Let's call it gridlock to be kind. What are the one or two things that you would sort of suggest to your colleagues, former colleagues on the Hill, that would help us bring back that collegiality? One of the things I always ask is, was it really the good old days when it was black and white? Maybe, maybe not, right? When you see an old film in black and white, were those days really better? Or was the fact that there wasn't even a refrigerator at the time not so good? So what are the one or two things that you would say are good? And I would also like, you've relayed a story to me, and I've seen the PBS documentary on your life, Congressman, some of the life lessons you learned from your mom. And Dan, I know you have a few as well. I'd like to also have a second part of that question.
Okay. Firstly, I think that there's been a great breakdown in communication. When one party says, I won't negotiate, you can't do that in a political situation. Also, when you have one party there that says that there'll be no compromise. Well, politics is the art of compromise. And a part of the problem there is some of the people who served there ran and got elected on a campaign in which they said, I'm going to Washington to get government out of your lives. If you get elected on the basis of that, you cannot then come to Washington and sit down and compromise. And that is the basic problem. They cannot communicate if that's the political situation there. This is not to say that when Dan and I were there that we didn't have problems. 17 years ago, the government shut down, and both of us were there at that time. That's in around '94 when Newt Gingrich came in and changed the whole face of Congress from the programs they brought in when they started the contract on America and so forth. During this interim period, 17 years, the government has not shut down again. That time it shut down for something like 20-some days, as I recall, almost 3 weeks. And so it's happened before. And there was a breakdown of communications at that time. So I think that you have to get people to sit down and talk to one another, which is what you're here for today, is to show how by cross-communication and being able to sit down and reason together, notwithstanding the fact you have different ideas and different ideology and different positions on issues, but at least if you sit down and talk, there's a possibility of being able to compromise.
Well, you know, I was intrigued. First of all, I agree with everything Lou said. I'm intrigued by your question, like, was it so good before? Mark Twain, 100 years ago, said there was only one true criminal class in America, and that's the Congress. So in that sense, you know, that we've always kind of had this belief that it's natural distrust and of the system, because our system was basically, listen, our system was set up to be inefficient. Imagine, we separate the president from the Congress, and then we split the Congress into two. So we're not, I mean, it's like it's 1 foot on the brake and 1 foot on the accelerator, under the best of circumstances. That's what people want. So because of that, you need, in addition to the compromise, I say there are 3 basic things you need that every institution has to have to survive. It could be a business or a nonprofit or government. One is leadership. So that's leadership at the executive branch, because I've worked in both executive and the legislative branches. The president doesn't effectively lead, or if the congressional leadership doesn't effectively lead. And leading means leading, not waiting to see who in your troops, what they necessarily, you got to listen to your troops, but you ultimately got to lead. And any business person knows that. The second thing is trust. You got to trust each other. And in today's world, the Democrats and Republicans do not trust each other at all. There's just a total breakdown of believing somebody's word and working together. I'm talking about from a macro sense. And the third thing is teamwork. I learned this mostly in my work in the Motion Picture Association. Every successful movie, every successful business has to have a high-performance team. And team means like a football team, or it could be a business team. And it's true in Congress, too. The team in Congress is the country. And today the team has become the cult of either the party or part of the party. And you know, the founding fathers, James Madison especially, and Washington too, they were really worried about political parties. They said they'd be destructive forces that would further divide America. But this concept of teamwork and how little of that we have in our national system, you think about it, working together as a team, and then how you all have to have that in your various institutions to survive, and how we rebuild this concept of teamwork is what I think is really important.
Yes, and you certainly mentioned leadership, and George and I always say it always starts at the top. Leadership is so important, and communication, of course, is important. Taking the lead on this bipartisan policy center, where do you begin to bring this bipartisan group together? How is that formed?
You know, it's funny, when you leave the Congress, you suddenly see the light. And so at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we have people like Trent Lott and Pete Domenici and Olympia Snow, who quit the Congress because of her great frustration, and now she's with us, and she's just written a book and is just very good on this subject. And then we try to use that bipartisanship and civility to work on substantive issues like energy and housing and healthcare and the debt deficit, to try to get people together. But it's still difficult, even in our work, to then get the legislative branch of government to kind of, you know, work together. And let me give you one example. So I was telling Lou, I lead this program at the Aspen Institute, so we take members of Congress on overseas conferences. We just came back from Ethiopia. We took 23 members of Congress and their spouses and scholars to Addis Ababa. We had a great trip. It was bipartisan. Members behaved beautifully. I mean, I'm telling you, it's like great affection and families working together and talking about substantive issues. In this case, it was the future of Africa and America's role, and we talked about foreign policy issues and everything else. And everybody did great. And then kind of what happens is they come back here and something happened. Maybe we ought to move the capital to Addis Ababa. Something just has kind of happened, and so there's real structural problems in our political system. And what causes it? Maybe it's the proliferation of money in our system. Maybe it's the 24-hour media in our system. Maybe, I mean, I'm sure there are a myriad of things that go into it. And of course, the respect for national government is the lowest it's been in ever and ever. I think leadership at the top makes it very important. I think that, but that's not even perfect, because you know, the vitriol that the let's say a lot of the Republican Party have for the president is, I've never seen anything like it in my life. Now, I would have to say that I'm not sure he's been as effective as a leader as I would like to say, but he doesn't deserve the vitriol that's coming before him. And you know, some presidents have done a better job. I think Clinton did a better job, and Reagan did a better job. But you also had Tip O'Neill with Reagan. They were able to work these things out. And Gingrich and Clinton had a good relationship. They were able to work things out. Now there seems to be no, I don't think they even talk. the leadership of Congress and leadership of the White House, and that's too bad, you know.
That's why I would say, I go back to the lack of communication again. Danny mentioned the trip that these members of Congress took together and how well they got along. We found that whenever members of Congress went on what they called codels, where we went abroad for the purpose of learning more about the legislative or the parliamentarian process, this was the first opportunity many of the members had to sit down together or to do anything together on a social basis. And so you'd go to the foreign countries, there'd be opportunities to socialize, not only with the people, the parliamentarians you were visiting, but with one another. On the airplanes, you get a chance to talk with one another. What they found out was that persons that you had seen and just said hello to here and there, but never sat down and had a conversation with, you had and sometimes didn't like. You found out you actually liked them, that they were pretty nice people. And, but there's a lack of that in the Congress. There's just no opportunity to socialize. And even on the floor, as Danny mentioned, the Congress is split there on the floor. The Republicans sit on this side, the Democrats sit on that side. Now you'll see here and there a member on one side or the other get up, go over, cross the aisle, sit down with another member. But generally, they're seated there together, and they have no real communication across the aisle. I found, working with people like Jerry Lewis of California, Jerry Lewis is Republican. Jerry, when I chaired the VA HUD independent agencies on appropriations, Jerry was my ranking member. And Jerry and I had a great personal friendship. And members of Congress used to cite the fact when others were differing with one another, they said, we ought to have more of the kind of relationship Lou Stokes and Jerry West have. And, but we just didn't have enough of that because they generally didn't know one another, had no socialization between them, and as a consequence of it, they really could not communicate.
You know, it's interesting. You read a lot of these books like Good to Be Great, and you know, you buy all these self-improvement books and you read them, but there is some truth to the fact that any institution to work has to have certain basic principles in place, which we've talked about. And by and large, that's not true in the Congress. It's true in the executive branch more because you have a lot of career employees and you have a lot of work that you do, and these are people's full-time jobs forever, but these techniques of getting along with each other and trust and building these relationships, very few members of Congress live in Washington anymore. To some extent, the public the public's part of the problem here, too. Let's not say that they aren't. The public likes it when members of Congress are sometimes at home, and I remember I lived in Washington with my children, and that's, back in those days, almost everybody did. I think less than 5% of members of Congress live in Washington. And a lot of them, God forbid, sleep in their offices. Can you imagine that? I mean, and you all are going to visit them after they've made the beds and cleaned the sheets, and then they're in the room and they're sleeping there, which is like, it's not only unsanitary, it's dehumanizing as well to do that kind of thing. But one quick story, when I was a freshman and you were there, it was in November 1977, Hubert Humphrey came and addressed the House. It was the first time a sitting senator, it wasn't a joint session, it was just addressing the House, and he was dying at the time, and so we honored him in some way, and he said, I'll never forget, he closed his speech, he says, I want to give you folks a piece of advice. Fight every battle like it was the most important battle in your life, but never burn bridges. Go to your adversary after you're done. Shake his hand, because 9 times out of 10, that adversary you will need as an ally in one of the next battles you're going to face. He said it a lot better than I did. And that's technique that you have to do in life pretty much, but we just don't do anymore in the legislative branch as we ought to be doing.
One other thing I'd like to mention is the lack of civility that now exists in the Congress. When I went there, I was taught by some of the real giants, some of the real giants in Congress at that time took time to mentor me. They explained to me that I was privileged to be a part of the greatest legislative body in the world, and that this was an institution that had a long and great history, long and great Americans that served there. And they told me that there's a manner in which you must conduct yourself in this body, the decorum, the civility that you must express when you stand on the floor, and no matter how much you disagree with your opponent on the floor, you're to conduct yourself in a respectful manner. And they taught me to say, I disagree with the gentleman from Virginia, but I want to say to the gentleman from Virginia, and gentleman is my good friend. And then you go into what you have to say, but you give that type of respect and demeanor to one another. We've seen a lack of that now. When I saw a member of the United States Congress at a State of the Union meeting where the President of the United States was speaking and a member of Congress said, "You're a liar," where the Speaker and the Vice President turned and looked at one another and could not believe they'd seen this occur in the House of Representatives. And in the speech that you see now on the floor, you don't see the cordiality and the gentleness. You don't see the kind of respect that we formerly saw in the Congress and that I was taught by my mentors. And then one other thing you don't see. I remember once, Dan, when President Reagan had a bill on the floor, and members were discussing and have dialogue over the bill, and I remember Speaker Tip O'Neill. Speaker Tip O'Neill went on the floor and spoke, and when he spoke, he said, "I didn't vote for President Reagan. He's not of my party, but he is my president. And if my president wants his legislation, I'm going to give it to him." You don't see that anymore. You don't see it.
And actually, Chris Matthews has written a book called Tip and the Gipper, and it's based on this very point. Politics stops at the water's edge. Both O'Neill and Reagan knew that, and they fought each other bitterly.
You know, there's no I in team. There is an I in Ideagen, and the tables are shaped like an I, but there is no I in team. This past weekend, I had the privilege of attending a conference with the HOSA Future Health Professionals, and they teach these kids leadership skills. And one of the simple techniques they were teaching them, and I was sort of taken back by it in a very positive way, was the technique of using the LCS, which is you express the fact that you like someone's idea, you come back with perhaps if you have a concern, and then you make an alternative suggestion. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing for the Congress to employ as part of a technique? It's a simple technique that they're teaching our nation's future health professionals. Tony Scrose, CEO, Adventure Partners, all about collaboration. A U.S. Olympic skier, 1,100 colleges and universities as partners. The Physician Assistant Foundation, my gosh, could we have more collaboration? You spend a lot more time with a PA these days. Jim Starr, volunteering, American Red Cross. Mark DeCourcy, hiding right there at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, doing amazing things, changing the world, and most importantly, communicating. These folks in the room are not here by accident. Ken Moritsugu, I need to call you out, Ken. Dr. Moritsugu, former U.S. Surgeon General, on our board, co-chair, and also just came out of Johnson & Johnson, now retired, but I don't think he'll ever retire, is a guy who also personifies collaboration. And so we have like-minded individuals in this room on purpose. Final question, what did you learn as a child that helped you succeed today? Congressman?
Well, I guess I'd have to go back to my mother. My brother Carl and I lost our father when I was 3 years old. Carl was a year old. And so she was a widow. and she's taking care of these two boys. And a woman with only an 8th grade education, came from the South, had gone to Cleveland as a young lady trying to find a little better life, and she wound up being a domestic, cleaning people's homes and taking care of their children and cleaning their homes, things of the sort. But her major mission as a mother was to see Carl and I get a high school diploma. Not college. She knew she couldn't send us to college. But she thought if we could get that high school diploma, that we would be able to compete. And in those days, you could. When I was a youngster, if you had a high school diploma, you could. And so she used to tell Carl and I, said, you know, get something in your head so you don't have to work with your hands like I've worked with my hands all of my life. And I guess I never really understood what she was saying until one day she was ill and she was lying in bed, and I went, stop.
That's okay, this portion's not being recorded, so we're But that is a nice ring.
Anyway, I'm sorry. But anyway, I remember that day I went in the bedroom where she was lying in such pain. I took her hands and felt those hard, callous hands from scrubbing people's floors in order to give me an education. And I began to understand what she was talking about when she said, get something in your head so you don't have to work with your hands like I've worked with my hands. And that to me was a turning point. That was a point where I realized that with what she had done for me, the least I could do was to try and get that high school diploma. I didn't know and had no idea that I'd be able later to take advantage of the GI Bill by serving in World War I, World War II.
You're in great shape.
Really big yeah. I served in World War II, and I was able then to take advantage of the GI Bill of Rights. But that's what gave me the drive and need to try and be something.
I'd say two things. One is, my dad was a shirt-tail comedian during the 30s, and he would have worked the circuit, except his family went broke, and he had to go back and work with his parents. They were in the scrap iron and metal business in Kansas, but the key to his success was always two things. One, self-deprecating humor. He says humor disarms everything, particularly if it's self-deprecating, and if you're kind of making fun of yourself. Tip O'Neill used to call this shining a lantern on your problems. And so I found that I've been able to kind of get out of almost every major scrape I'm in just by making fun of myself and being funny. I mean, it's relative whether you think I'm funny or not, but that's something else. And so that self-deprecating humor humanizes a situation, disarms conflict. I've seen it happen over and over again where you can just extinguish chaos and crisis by that. And that was from my dad. And the other thing both my parents were very big on is they didn't come from humble surroundings, but they weren't wealthy people anyway. And you know, back in the Depression era days, there were like in Wichita, there were like, my dad says there were like 5 multimillionaires, and it was the reverse of it was not the 1%, it was the 0.0000001%. And then everybody else was kind of in the similar situation. You know, nobody had any money to speak of, but they kind of got along. And he said he used to find he was successful, that no matter what he did, he was always optimistic. So people would ask him how business was. And he said, terrific, even when they were close to bankruptcy. And I said, why'd you do that? He says, nobody wants to do business with an unsuccessful person. They only want to do business with people who are doing well. So that note of optimism was really, really important. And he was like that. Both my parents were like that till they died.
That is amazing. You know, I would like to thank you both on behalf of everyone here today. I think everyone echoes the profound lessons that we've learned today from both of you. Two gentlemen in an era perhaps of lack of civility. And hopefully we can put some pressure on the folks to bring back civility, to communicate, because I don't think it matters whether you're a Republican or Democrat and have different ideas, as long as you can communicate. And I think what we heard from you both today was, look, all we need is communication. You can argue the issues like Tip O'Neill and Reagan did, but at the end of the night, why don't we be friends? So on that note, we consider you certainly friends and family. Thank you. And God bless America. Let's get the government back.